Greetings everyone at the AMNAT conference. I'm very honored to make this presentation on intelligently designed errors, Rube Goldberg machines, and self-destructive designs. Some preliminaries. There are practical reasons for alternatives to methodological naturalism, and they won't be covered here. They were actually covered in my presentation last year, Gambler's Epistemology. And there'll be two other presentations today that will talk about practical reasons for alternatives to methodological naturalism. The justification for that is how naturalism is actually negatively impacting medical research. Today I'll actually be covering philosophical and theological reasons for alternatives to methodological naturalism. Even though this is a biology AMNAT, this presentation was actually requested by Johnny B. So if you don't like it, you can complain to him. One reason I addressed this, I want to offer some theological counter-arguments to Christian Darwinists insisting on naturalism. I'll cover the bad design argument. I'll try to give some answers as to why God would deliberately make quote-unquote bad designs, and I'll justify that also by examples of bad design in the man-made world. At the end, I'll suggest my alternative to methodological naturalism is simply that we exclude naturalism, supernaturalism, and even ID. So the basic bad design argument goes something like this. If God exists, he wouldn't create a world with so much evil and bad designs. If God exists, he wouldn't make the designs we see. God wouldn't create something like childhood bone cancer. God didn't hear my prayers for my ailing loved one. Therefore, God doesn't exist. Now, I don't mean to minimize at all any of the human suffering that's going on out there. In fact, I began to consider these questions at a very personal, very, very personal level when my father was announced to the family he was terminally ill, and he passed away in 2003. That's actually how I got involved in the intelligent design movement, because I was trying to find answers to the bad design argument. So Charles Darwin had some interesting quotes. He had mixed and very conflicting feelings about intelligent design, and I'll just quote him. I think a lot of people can identify with what he has to say. Darwin said, "One cannot look at this universe with all living productions and man without believing that all is intelligently designed." Amazingly, he said the opposite. He took on also the opposite view. This very old argument from the existence of suffering against the existence of an intelligent first cause seems to me a strong one. I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created parasitic wasps express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars. And what a book a devil's chaplain might write on the clumsy, wasteful, blundering, low, and horribly cruel work of nature. So here I was dealing with my father's illness, and so I asked for responses for the bad design argument. And these are kind of a sampling of the responses I got. They were not very satisfying to me. I'll just list them here. It's kind of personal, but I'll talk about it anyway because I know it's on a lot of people's minds. God didn't create a bad world. He created a good one. Then man sinned and made the world bad. Bad design and evil and an evil world are not God's fault. It's ours. So the problem with this response, even if it's true, it doesn't answer the question really being asked. That is why did God put a snake in the Garden of Eden in the first place? To make all this bad, to make all this bad design even possible. Engineers would think, well, where's the robustness and fault tolerance here? The idea gives also what I felt was a not so satisfying answer. This kind of represents the standard ID response to bad design. Well, intelligent design doesn't explain bad design. The design inference doesn't depend on good design. ID avoids the question. And that may be all true, but at a gut level, the bad design argument holds a lot of even if the design inference is supported by math. And unfortunately, the bad design argument is a door for naturalism to intrude upon science. Again, this was at a very personal level, so I could identify it. So I'm not trying to criticize anyone really in particular. I'm just expressing my reaction. So a bad design proponent, and I alluded to it earlier, he'll rebut some of these standard Christian apologetics and ID responses to bad design. He'll say, well, why did God create a perfect world only to put a snake in paradise that tempted humanity? Would any dad put a snake in his children's room? Where's the fault prevention? And as far as ID, well, there's no need to rebut non-existent ID responses to bad design. So at the time, and this was around 2001, these seemed like insurmountable objections. Now, I have my solution to the bad design argument. Now, I would preface all this by saying my solution is not necessarily correct. It's the one that satisfies me. But the importance of me putting this on the table is just to show that bad design does not necessarily imply no design or stupid design. And unless bad design proponents can conclusively show God would not design things that way, then the bad design argument has no place in science because it's not proven to be absolutely true. So here are parts of my solutions. Something like the Super Bowl here in the United States, it's a great event, a great cultural, a great part of American culture. The Super Bowl as a matter of principle implies mostly bad outcomes for teams competing for the Super Bowl trophy. So as a matter of principle, there have to be bad outcomes and, if you will, bad design. To circumvent this problem, the supposed problem 20 years ago, or even more than that, some people said, well, you know, it's not really good that kids ever experience the sorrow of losing. That's kind of bad. It destroys their self-esteem. So they created these Little League baseball teams that had no losers. So at the end, the kids would play a game. At the end of the game, they would all declare both teams winners, no losers, at least officially. That idea didn't last because the kids kept unofficial score. They knew who the real winners and losers are. On a more formal level, computer languages, as a matter of principle, must allow a vastly larger space of invalid syntactical constructs than valid ones. Otherwise, the language will be devoid of meaning. The possibility of disaster is a necessity for things to work. At the end, I'll also cover how Shannon's theorem shows that information technology is best implemented by allowing, in fact, creating designed errors that are remediated later. That sounds a little bit like allowing a world to go down the tubes and then remediating it later. I do have some philosophical considerations, theological actually, from the scriptures if you want to explore that. We can do that in the Q&A. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the technical side here. So an example of what's sometimes considered bad design are Rube Goldberg machines. A Rube Goldberg machine is a contraption, invention, device, or apparatus that is deliberately over-engineered to perform a simple task in a complicated fashion, generally including a chain reaction. The expression is named after American cartoonist and inventor Rube Goldberg. So, are Rube Goldberg machines designed for the glory of the designee or the designer? How does one judge if a Rube Goldberg machine is well designed or badly designed? That's a rhetorical question. Rube Goldberg machines express the ingenuity of the designer, not for the benefit of the design of the designed object, nor even the efficiency of the task. And I've often argued life is a Rube Goldberg replicator. The problem of origin of life is the existence of Rube Goldberg replicators, not the problem of simple replicators like salt crystals or autocatalytic reactions. There's a picture of a man-made conception of a Rube Goldberg machine. And surprisingly, somewhat like the God-made Rube Goldberg machine of the human metabolism. These are all the chemical metabolic pathways. Actually, that's just a small sampling of them. It looks like a Rube Goldberg machine. So, are Rube Goldberg machines good or bad designs? If naturalism can't definitively answer the question, there's no justification to intrude on science based on what may look like bad designs that are really Rube Goldberg machines. One could argue the backward wiring of the retina, by the way, is a Rube Goldberg machine. It turns out the wiring itself acts as a fiber optic light focusing system. So now, Rube Goldberg machines show philosophical flaws in the bad design argument. Naturalism tends to be designee, as in we humans, centric rather than designer centric. Again, theologically, you could look at John 9:13, the account of the blind man who was born blind, and they're asking, why was he born blind? Jesus said, born blind so that the glory of God may be shown. Going on, an evolutionary biologist said this: products of intelligent design typically have capabilities that exceed usefulness and complications that would be profoundly maladaptive in a living system. A very good example of this, something that was not lost on Charles Darwin, is the peacock's tail. It's a symbolic Rube Goldberg machine. It made Darwin sick because such a tail is a liability to survival. It's not a benefit. Therefore, it seemed to falsify his theory, and I would argue it actually did. The proof of this is that complex multicellular creatures are going extinct at an alarming rate. It proves that such things as the peacock's tail are a liability, not a benefit. In fact, peacocks, peafowls are an endangered species as of right now. Natural selection eliminates such kinds of extravagant complexity. It doesn't create it. Now, let's go to the man-made world to see if we have things like this. We have the Monsanto Terminator Traitor seeds. They are self-destructive designs, and these are biological designs with absolutely no survival advantage. Seeds that they are seeds that create plants when they're planted, but then they don't reproduce. They don't, if it grows corn, you can't take the corn and replant it. That was through genetic engineering. Monsanto sells this to farmers. It forces farmers to go back to Monsanto, the intelligent designer, to plead for mercy and pay money so that these poor farmers can plant seeds again. And one time, someone was saying to me, he said, "Gee, Sal, are you saying God acts like Monsanto?" To which I responded, "No, actually I was trying to say Monsanto is trying to act like God." So, at least on a more philosophical question, why are there self-destructive designs like mortal man? Why not make man immortal? Well, this is just a purely philosophical speculation. Man is designed to know that he is not God. Being mortal is a powerful reminder of that. Man is designed to know his need of God. Evolutionary biology tends to be designee-centric, saying, well, it's the needs of man that are the most important. It's not designer-centric. A bad design arguments partly emerge from a designee-centric viewpoint rather than a designer-centric viewpoint. And by the way, prior to Darwin, the peacock's tail was seen as something created to make man wonder at the creator, not to confer survival advantage to the peacock. So we have depicted here is you could see the double helix here, the DNA is being formed by a polymerase. The polymerase is a molecule that helps replicate the DNA, and then it also does proofreading. And sometime way back, we were just marveling at this at Access Research Network, and we were talking about it, and some random Darwinist weighed in, and he said, he said this in response to us. He said, the intelligent designer is stupid to create error correction and proofreading for DNA. He should have created systems that don't need error correction and proofreading in the first place. But because I was an electrical engineer, I actually kind of saw the flaw in that criticism, even though superficially it seems like a good one. So this is a good opportunity to show how it's actually intelligent to create errors and then fix them later. The easiest example, it's not exactly the one to the point, but it's just a start. It's a simple example of telephone bandwidth. In our cell phones and the old style cell phones, you could hear that the sound isn't really perfect. It's just adequate. That's done for economic reasons. The bandwidth is limited to about 300 kilohertz, even though the human ear can hear up to about 20 kilohertz. It's just simply not needed. In fact, we could probably design telephone systems that could go in the 100 kilohertz range, but that would be a total waste. So instead, we deliberately, quote unquote, put some errors in there because there's a higher purpose involved, meaning the economy. But now, more to the point, why deliberately break something only to repair it later? It turns out there are examples of this in electrical engineering. Data on compact disks and other digital storage devices and communication systems are a good example. This is actually a consequence of Claude Shannon's famous theorem that deals with how much data can be transmitted or stored if error correction is used. It's a classic and continuing problem in digital communication and storage to apply Shannon's theorems effectively. A good example of this, as I'll cover it a little bit, Reed-Solomon coding, which does error correction for compact disks. The math actually demonstrates the optimality of designing errors in one dimension to achieve greater function in another. Now, unfortunately, we're not going to get to the technical part because this is the only way to really explain it. The above equation made Claude Shannon famous. It put him on the map. He became the father of information theory as a result of the internet. It's that equation. It's surprisingly, the end result was surprisingly simple. What this does is it tells you how much capacity can be on a communication channel, be it a wire or a compact disk. So C is the channel capacity in bits per second, or actually bits per square inch. I should have amended that on the slide. It could be bits per second, bits per square inch, or some other measure. B is the bandwidth of the channel in hertz, or bits per square inch, or some other measure. S is the signal level. It can be in watts. It's the average level. And N is the average noise level. So we all kind of can have ideas of this. If you're in a noisy room, there's a high level of noisy energy. To be able to speak clearly with someone, you just have to talk louder. That's increasing the average signal strength. So we actually know some of these facts intuitively. So now, just ignore the rest of the text. I'm just going to give you a diagram here. First, let's go to the pencil and paper analogy. So let's say we're trying to write more data on a piece of paper. Well, your bandwidth increases as you write smaller and smaller, right? If you can put more letters on the piece of paper if you write very, very small. It increases your bandwidth. And the bandwidth is actually, in this case, inversely proportional to the signal, meaning you don't get as good an optical signal because the letters are small. So as you write smaller letters, you decrease the signal. It makes it smaller. However, the noise level stays constant. That's because the size of your pencil and properties of the paper, you're always going to get some imprecision and noise. So the noise level stays constant. Therefore, the signal divided by noise, the signal to noise ratio gets worse as you write smaller and smaller. It really doesn't scale. So this is the problem that Claude Shannon was working to resolve. And Shannon says you can pack the maximum amount of data on the paper if you create reading and writing mistakes but correct them later. Now, practically speaking, you can't do that with paper and pencil, but it's possible in the electronic realm, especially with computers on the sending and receiving end. You need computation to be happening on the sending and receiving end. So let's say this is a hypothetical example of us analyzing how to write data on a CD. So the rectangles represent the signal strength from a bit on the surface of a CD. And the bandwidth is inversely proportional to the rectangle size, by the way. So that means if you take very large areas to write a single bit on the CD, you're not going to get very good bandwidth. You can't cram so much data per unit area on the CD. But you do have better signal. Unfortunately, in the read due to the read-write heads is fixed. So it's kind of nice that you can write to a bigger area and therefore not have as much noise, but then the trade-off is you can't cram as much data. So let's just kind of hypothetically put these considerations in play. So we'll have one situation where we have one level of signal strength, and in this case we have 1,000 bits per square inch, and the signal to noise ratio will be 8. That's on the left side. On the right side, the blue example, we'll just arbitrarily decide to put twice as much data on the disk by the bit occupy less area, half as much area as compared to the example on the left side, the green side. So we get 2,000 bits per square inch. But our signal to noise ratio goes down to 4, which means we're actually creating a lot more errors per bit. We're creating a lot more errors per bit. So which is better? Well, if you use Shannon's theorem, it'll work out that the case on the right, the blue case, actually creates better data storage. It's better to create errors and then remediate them later. And that is exactly what's happening on your compact disks with the Reed-Solomon coding. And by the way, I should point out something kind of cute. The bandwidth is only 1,000 bits per square inch. Going back to the left case, it's only 1,000 bits per square inch. But Shannon says you can actually store 3,169.9 bits per square inch. Now, that seems to violate some sort of conservation rule. Turns out it doesn't. Because Shannon anticipated data compression. I don't know that when he wrote that theorem that he actually really knew all the implications, but he realized you could start to apply data compression based on the amount of noise. So what's the applicability of Shannon's theorems and deliberate errors? It obviously applies to compact disks, the Reed-Solomon coding. It applies to digital communications, really all digital communications, where there are a variety of error correction schemes. It also works really well in nanomolecular storage systems, where there is a lot of thermal and quantum noise. And what might there be one example of that? Well, ta-da! The polymerase, where you have errors written and then proofread and remediated later. So it turns out this is actually intelligently designed errors, even in our DNA. So the conclusion is, naturalism cannot stand on the bad design argument. Naturalism cannot use the bad design argument in evaluation of medically relevant biological systems. Naturalism should not be a part of science for philosophical and practical reasons. I suggested a metaphysically neutral conception of science.
All right, thanks, Salvador. I'll open up the floor now for some questions. So one thing that occurs to me is that not only do you show that bad design doesn't invalidate the intelligent design argument, but it seems like bad design actually makes the intelligent design stronger because it's more difficult to have these suboptimal systems that allow even better results.
Eric was just commenting that errors actually make the case for intelligent design stronger. There are dimensions where that is absolutely the case, and I tried to argue that forcefully today. We see it with computer science. You can't have computer science languages that have no syntax errors. It has to have the possibility of disaster. And then secondly, you could see stuff with Shannon right there, and it's very applicable at the molecular level, having designs there. So I actually think it's a good evidence of design. And even before we got to this advanced math, Darwin saw it. He saw it with the peacock's tail. It really bothered him. It made him sick, physically sick. There are not many things I think make me physically sick when I think about it. That's one example. Would you all like me to, I said we could review kind of the theological thing in the question and answer. Again, I'm not trying to be insensitive to anyone. These questions came up to me because when I actually got involved in the intelligent design movement because I was dealing with personal tragedy, my father being terminally ill. And so the question of Genesis 3, why did God put a snake in the Garden of Eden? It turns out in Deuteronomy 13, God allows all these false prophets to tempt the children of Israel. And that sounded hauntingly familiar to what was happening in Genesis 3. In Deuteronomy 13, the false prophets are the children of the serpent. So why did this happen? And God actually gives the reason. He said he's trying to find out, he's trying to test the people to see who truly loves God with all their heart and all their mind, all their soul. So God was looking for true love. So that explains, again, from a designer-centric viewpoint, it begins to make sense. Why? Because the story of the Garden of Eden wasn't really about Adam and Eve. It's about God's search for the true love. And then also, in the New Testament, we have 2 Corinthians 4:17, which says that the momentary light affliction is building for us a weight of glory that is beyond all comprehension, so that the pain we're suffering today is part of necessary to make the next life better. And we saw a little hint of this in the last Super Bowl. For those who are New England Patriots fans, I actually was rooting for the Atlanta Falcons. But in the third quarter, the Patriots were behind 28-3, and it looked like they're going to lose the game. Well, they eventually tied the game and then won it, and many sports writers said this is the greatest Super Bowl ever. And sometimes the difficulty that is suffered at one point in time actually makes the final outcome even better. And then there's the account in John 9, chapter 9, verses 1 through 3, where the apostles encounter a blind man and says, why is this man blind? Is it the sin of his parents, or is it his sin? And Jesus responds, it's neither. It's so that the glory of God may be manifest. That is my solution, kind of a theological solution to the bad design argument. And I think it hits home for a lot of people. Darwin himself had a daughter that got sick and then passed away. A few historians have said that may have motivated his very hostile view toward intelligent design, even though you could see even one of his quotes had said that it's hard for him not to think that there wasn't intelligent design. It was very hard. So, any more questions?
Jim Johansson says, another argument against bad design is there are other aspects of the design we did not understand.
Oh, I agree with that. We're learning that a lot now. I will cover that some actual examples where where evolutionary biologists have said numerous examples of DNA that they considered bad design. It turned out to be very elegant design. That'll be in my presentation this afternoon on naturalism versus experiments on non-coding DNA.
And Royal Truman and Jim Johansen have a couple other examples. Royal Truman says another example are protein degradation and recycling. And second example is different polymerases are fast, slow for different purposes. Fast with few easily corrected errors is pretty brilliant. Under crisis conditions, a polymerase known to create errors is used by bacteria to deliberately generate protein variety. And then Jim Johansen says, pre-distortion filtering purposefully distorts the data before it's sent out in the COM channel. Knowing with the channel and the decoding, it can perform better. There's different examples where you start with something that's suboptimal to get even better results.
Well, I knew that there are at least a couple electrical engineers in the audience there, Walter Riemann and Jim Johansen, so I knew if I made mistakes, I better be up on my game, so I tried to get my Shannon math correct.
And then Dennis Pullis says, yes, this is a sub-optimization fallacy because God's not designing organisms in isolation. And Dennis Pullis says, optimizing subsystems does not normally optimize the system as a whole. In computer science, we have a saying that premature optimization is the root of all evil. Okay, well, I think we are at an end then for this talk.